In a quiet corner of northwest Washington, surrounded by 25 acres of manicured gardens, stands a mansion that looks like a museum because it is one. 36 rooms filled with Fabergé eggs, Imperial Russian chalices, French furniture that once graced Versailles, orchids blooming in greenhouses, rose gardens meticulously tended, a chandelier from Catherine the Great's palace hanging over a breakfast nook. This is Hillwood Estate, and it is beautiful in the way that only enormous wealth can create. But beauty this extreme always costs more than money. Walk through the rose garden, and you will find an obelisk. Beneath it lies Marjorie Merriweather Post, the woman who built this dream. She died here in 1973 at age 86, buried in her own estate, surrounded by treasures she spent a lifetime collecting. She was once the wealthiest woman in America. She inherited a cereal fortune at 27 and turned it into an empire that fed the nation. She married 4 times. She built multiple palaces. She collected Russian imperial art with an obsession that bordered on hunger. She wanted to give it all away, to be remembered, to matter. The Smithsonian said no. This is the story of how an inheritance that seemed infinite was consumed by a single woman's need to prove something that could never quite be proven. How millions upon millions of dollars were poured into houses and art and beauty until the fortune itself began to crack. How a woman who had everything discovered that everything was never enough. How a mansion can swallow not just money but marriages, years, lives, and still stand there afterward, beautiful and cold and demanding more. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you enjoy learning about the fascinating histories behind the world's most remarkable estates, consider subscribing to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. I love seeing how this community stretches across the globe, united by our shared curiosity about these architectural treasures and the complicated people who built them. This is a story about wealth, but more than that, it is a story about what wealth does to the people who possess it, and what they sacrifice trying to make it mean something. Chapter 1. The Cereal Princess. The story begins not in a mansion, but in a barn. Springfield, Illinois. March 15, 1887. Marjorie Merriweather Post was born the only child of Charles William Post and Ella Letitia Merriweather. The family was not wealthy, not yet. Her father was a salesman struggling with health problems and business failures, a man whose ambitions seemed perpetually larger than his circumstances. They moved to Battle Creek, Michigan when Marjorie was 3, chasing a cure for C.W. Post's various ailments at Dr. John Harvey Kellogg's famous sanitarium. What C.W. found in Battle Creek was not just treatment, but inspiration. Kellogg preached the gospel of healthy eating, of grain-based foods, of alternatives to the coffee and meat that supposedly poisoned the American body. C.W. listened. He absorbed. And in 1894, 7 years after Marjorie's birth, he created Postum, a coffee substitute made from roasted wheat bran and molasses. At first, nobody wanted it. Young Marjorie, aged 7, 8, 9, helped her father in the barn that served as his factory. She glued cereal boxes. She learned early that wealth did not arrive magically, but was built by hand, piece by piece, box by box. Her father took her to business meetings even when she was 10, teaching her to read ledgers, to understand profit margins, to think like someone who built things instead of merely inheriting them. Then Postum started to sell, and sell, and sell. By the turn of the century, C.W. Post was a millionaire. By the time Marjorie reached her teenage years, he was a multimillionaire. Grape Nut cereal followed Postum. Post Toasties followed Grape Nuts. The Postum Cereal Company became one of the most successful food manufacturers in America. The barn was replaced by factories. The modest house was replaced by a mansion. Marjorie went from gluing boxes to attending finishing school, from Battle Creek poverty to New York society. But something in those early years stayed with her. The memory of the barn, the memory of not having enough, the knowledge that wealth was fragile, that it could vanish, that you had to hold on to it, build it, prove you deserved it. C.W. Post taught his daughter to be shrewd, to be ambitious, to never settle. But he also taught her something darker, though perhaps he did not mean to. He taught her that worth was measured in what you built, in what you owned, in what others could see and envy. He taught her that love was conditional and that approval was earned through success. In 1905, at age 18, Marjorie married Edward Bennett Close, a well-connected investment banker. It was a society match, the kind of marriage that wealthy families arrange to consolidate position and fortune. She gave birth to two daughters, Adelaide in 1908 and Eleanor in 1909. She moved into New York society, furnishing her Manhattan townhouse in the French neoclassical style that was fashionable among the wealthy elite. She began collecting, tentatively at first, pieces of French furniture, decorative arts, small, beautiful things. The collecting would never stop. Then, in 1914, everything changed. C.W. Post had been struggling with depression for years, a darkness that money and success could not fix. On May 9, 1914, he took his own life. Marjorie was 27. Overnight, she inherited the Postum Cereal Company. Overnight, she inherited $20 million, the equivalent of many billions today. Overnight. She became one of the wealthiest women in the United States. The weight of that inheritance was immediate and crushing. Women could not vote in 1914. Women were not expected to run businesses. The board of directors at Postum looked at their young female owner with barely concealed skepticism. But Marjorie had been trained by her father. She knew the business. She understood the numbers. She was smart, focused, and utterly determined not to let the fortune her father built slip away. She joined the board of directors. She attended meetings. She made decisions. The men around her learned quickly that underestimating her was a mistake. But the inheritance came with something else. Something less tangible, but far more dangerous. It came with the need to prove herself, to show that she deserved this wealth, to build something worthy of the fortune her father had left. To be remembered not just as C.W. Post's daughter, but as someone who mattered in her own right. That need would consume the next 60 years of her life. That need would build palaces and break marriages and fill rooms with treasures and still always leave her wanting more. Marjorie Merriweather Post stood at the beginning of her inheritance in 1914, impossibly wealthy, utterly alone. The barn was far behind her. The mansions lay ahead, and between them stretched a lifetime of trying to fill an emptiness that no amount of beauty or treasure could ever quite touch. Chapter 2. The first fortune spent money Marjorie discovered was both freedom and cage. With her inheritance, she could buy almost anything. She could travel to Europe and purchase French furniture by the roomful. She could commission art, hire the best decorators, dress in clothes that cost more than most Americans earned in a year. She could move through society as an equal to the Vanderbilts and Astors, though they still looked at her sideways, still saw cereal money as somehow less legitimate than railroad or banking fortunes. That sideways glance stayed with her. Her marriage to Edward Bennett Close was crumbling. The war in Europe disrupted their lives in small ways. Close volunteered for service, received medals, came back changed. Or perhaps he had always been unsuited to a wife who was wealthier, smarter, and more ambitious than he was. Perhaps Marjorie had always been unsuited to marriage itself, to the subordination it required, to the pretense that her husband was somehow her superior. In 1919, they divorced. Marjorie kept the daughters. She kept the fortune. Close kept his dignity and soon remarried. It was civilized, as these things went among the wealthy. But it established a pattern that would repeat itself 3 more times over the coming decades. Marjorie could not keep husbands, but she could keep houses. In 1920, she married Edward Francis Hutton, the Wall Street titan who had founded the investment firm E.F. Hutton and Company. He was handsome, charming, brilliant with money. He made her laugh. He understood business in a way Close never had. For a while, it seemed like the perfect match. 2 ambitious people building an empire together, and build they did. E.F. Hutton became chairman of the board of the Postum Cereal Company in 1923. Together, he and Marjorie began acquiring other food companies with a strategy that was ruthless and visionary. Jell-O in 1925. Baker's Chocolate, which had been making chocolate in America since the late 1700s, in 1927. Maxwell House Coffee in 1928. That iconic brand with the slogan, quote, "Zero," quote, that Theodore Roosevelt had supposedly coined. The Postum Cereal Company was becoming something far larger than cereal. It was becoming a food conglomerate that would reshape how Americans ate. But the acquisitions that would change everything came in 1929. The company was renamed General Foods Corporation, and Marjorie convinced a skeptical E.F. Hutton to purchase Clarence Birdseye's frozen food company and patents. The story of that purchase reveals everything about Marjorie's instincts and her hunger. They were sailing on their yacht, the Hussar, departing from Gloucester, Massachusetts. At dinner, Marjorie tasted the roasted goose and was struck by how fresh and flavorful it was. She asked the chef about it. The goose, she learned, had been frozen for months using a revolutionary new process developed by a local inventor named Clarence Birdseye. Birdseye had figured out how to flash freeze food between refrigerated metal plates, preventing ice crystals from forming and preserving taste and texture in ways no previous freezing method had achieved. Marjorie saw the future instantly. Frozen food could be shipped anywhere. It would not spoil. It could make fresh food available to millions of people year-round. In every corner of the country, it was convenience and modernity and profit all wrapped together. She told Hutton they should buy the company for $2 million. Hutton said no. He pointed out the obvious problems. Americans did not have home freezers. Grocery stores did not have freezer cases. Delivery trucks were not refrigerated. The infrastructure did not exist to make frozen food profitable. It was risky. Far ahead of its time, Marjorie kept pushing, for months, for years. She knew she was right. She knew this was the future. Finally, in 1929, Hutton agreed. By then, the price had gone up. They paid Clarence Birdseye approximately $22 million for his company and patents, 10 times what Marjorie had originally proposed. They kept Birdseye on as a consultant and vice president. They launched Birdseye Frozen Foods and began the slow, expensive process of creating the infrastructure needed to make it work. It worked spectacularly. Within years, frozen food became a standard part of American life. General Foods became one of the largest food corporations in the world. The Post fortune, already vast, multiplied again and again. But all that wealth, all that success, was never quite enough. While building General Foods, Marjorie was also building houses. In 1922, she purchased and extensively renovated the Warburton Hall estate on Long Island, creating a sprawling Tudor-style mansion she called Hillwood. It would be the first of several properties to bear that name, a word that became synonymous in her mind with home, with permanence, with the place she belonged. Then, in 1924, she and Hutton found 17 acres of land in Palm Beach, Florida, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth. She hired Marion Sims Wyeth, one of Palm Beach's finest architects, and Joseph Urban, the extravagant designer who created sets for the Ziegfeld Follies and the Metropolitan Opera. Together, they designed Mar-a-Lago, the Cedar Lake Palace. Construction took 4 years and consumed between $7 and $10 million, the equivalent of well over $100 million today. 115 rooms, gold-plated bathroom fixtures, which Marjorie insisted were practical because gold was easier for servants to clean. A 75-foot tower, Spanish tiles by the thousands, marble imported from Europe, craftsmen brought from Italy to carve wooden ceilings, a staff of 60 at full operation to keep the palace running. Marjorie poured her vision into Mar-a-Lago, the way some people pour themselves into children or art. It was her answer to the old money families who still looked at her sideways, who still saw cereal money as inferior. "Look at this," the mansion said. "Try to dismiss this. Try to pretend I do not matter when I own something this magnificent." But even as Mar-a-Lago was being built, the marriage to Hutton was beginning to fracture. He was unfaithful, repeatedly. even humiliatingly, with a maid who lived in their home. Marjorie set traps to prove his infidelity, elaborate schemes involving bells and threads and talcum powder to detect footsteps where they should not be. In 1935, they divorced. Marjorie kept Mar-a-Lago. She kept the Long Island Hillwood. She kept the majority of the wealth. She kept their daughter, Nadinia Marjorie Hutton, who would later become famous as the actress Dina Merrill. Hutton kept his firm and his freedom and eventually married someone else. It was the second marriage Marjorie had lost. But the houses remained. The collections remained. The hunger for more, always more, remained. The pattern was set. Husbands came and went. Wealth accumulated and was spent. And somewhere in all of it, there was a woman trying to build something permanent, something that would outlast her, something that would prove she deserved the fortune that had fallen into her lap when her father pulled a trigger and left her alone with $20 million and a barn's worth of memories. Chapter 3. Moscow Gold. In December of 1935, barely months after her divorce from E.F. Hutton was finalized, Marjorie married again. Her third husband was Joseph Edward Davies, a Washington lawyer who had served as chairman of the Federal Trade Commission. He was 58, a decade older than Marjorie, a man of political connections and intellectual ambition. He had been married before. So had she, twice. They understood each other's complications. What neither of them could have predicted was how this marriage would reshape Marjorie's obsessions and ultimately define her legacy. In November of 1936, President Franklin Roosevelt appointed Joseph Davies as United States ambassador to the Soviet Union. It was a crucial posting. Stalin ruled Russia with absolute power. The Soviet experiment in communism was entering its most brutal phase. Purges were beginning. Show trials were eliminating anyone Stalin perceived as a threat. And looming over everything was the growing threat of Nazi Germany and the question of whether the Soviet Union would resist or accommodate Hitler's expansion. Davies and Marjorie arrived in Moscow in January of 1937. They moved into Spaso House, the American ambassador's residence, a grand building that had once belonged to a Russian merchant before the revolution. Marjorie's role was ceremonial, but essential. She was expected to host dinners, to facilitate diplomatic relationships, to create an atmosphere where Soviet officials and American representatives could meet on neutral ground. She did all of that. But what she really did was shop. The Soviet government was desperate for hard currency. Stalin's industrialization plans required foreign machinery, foreign expertise, foreign goods that could only be purchased with dollars or pounds or francs. The communist regime had seized vast treasures from the Romanov Imperial family, from aristocratic estates, from Orthodox churches, gold chalices, jeweled icons, Fabergé eggs, porcelain dinner services that had been made for empresses, furniture that had filled palaces, paintings and sculptures and objects of stunning beauty that represented centuries of Russian culture and craftsmanship. All of it was for sale. State-run commission shops sold imperial treasures to anyone with foreign currency. Warehouses full of confiscated art were open to Western buyers. The Soviets did not care about preservation or heritage. They cared about tractors and steel mills and the military buildup that would be needed to survive what was coming. Marjorie Post Davies walked through those warehouses and felt something ignite inside her. She had collected French furniture and decorative arts for years. But this was different. This was not just beautiful. This was tragic. This was the physical remnants of a civilization that had been violently destroyed, being sold off piece by the people who had destroyed it. The Romanov family had been murdered in a basement in Yekaterinburg in 1918. Their possessions had been scattered, hidden, seized by the state, and were now being liquidated. Marjorie could save them, or at least she told herself she was saving them. She began buying with a focus that bordered on mania. Fabergé eggs, those jeweled masterpieces that the Imperial family had exchanged as Easter gifts. She would eventually own two, the Catherine the Great egg and the Imperial Napoleonic egg. She purchased porcelain dinner services, some bearing the Imperial eagles, some decorated with scenes of Russian life. She bought icons, Orthodox religious art that glowed with gold leaf and depicted saints with solemn faces. She acquired Chalice's investments that had been used in church services before the churches were closed or converted to other uses. She crawled through dusty storage rooms. She negotiated prices with Soviet officials who barely concealed their contempt for the wealthy American woman spending money on what they considered useless relics. She spent tens of thousands of dollars, then hundreds of thousands. The exact total is lost to history, but it was vast. Her husband, Ambassador Davies, participated as well. He bought art for himself, paintings and sculptures that would later become controversial when allegations emerged that some had been seized not just from the Romanovs, but from Soviet citizens during Stalin's purges, sold at artificially low prices, or even given as nominal gifts to the American ambassador. Marjorie did not seem troubled by the moral complexity. Or if she was, she buried it beneath the thrill of acquisition. She was preserving history, she told herself. She was keeping these treasures from being destroyed or melted down. She was doing a service to culture, to art, to the memory of Imperial Russia. But there was something else, something she probably did not admit even to herself. She was buying proof, proof that she mattered, proof that she had taste sophisticated enough to recognize what was valuable. Proof that she could possess what empresses had possessed, that her wealth put her on a level with royalty. The time in Moscow was surreal. While Marjorie shopped for Fabergé eggs, Stalin's Great Purge was killing hundreds of thousands of people. Show trials condemned old Bolsheviks to execution. The NKVD secret police operated with terrifying efficiency. Foreign diplomats, including Davies, attended some of these trials and sent reports back to Washington trying to make sense of what was happening. Marjorie hosted dinners, she entertained Soviet officials, she paired French and Russian porcelain with pink and yellow orchids. She created elegant spaces where diplomats could pretend for a few hours that they were not living in a police state on the edge of war. She also apparently saw nothing contradictory about spending enormous sums on treasures while ordinary Soviets faced shortages and hunger, while Stalin's policies created famines and suffering on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. Wealth insulates. It creates bubbles where the suffering of others becomes abstract, becomes something happening somewhere else to someone else. Marjorie lived in that bubble. She had always lived in that bubble, and Moscow only reinforced it. Davies' posting ended in June of 1938. The couple moved to Brussels, where Davies served briefly as ambassador to Belgium, before the war made the position untenable. They returned to Washington in 1939, bringing with them crates and crates of Russian art. Marjorie's collection was unlike anything in the Western world. It was the most comprehensive assemblage of Russian imperial art outside of Russia itself. Museums would eventually envy it. Scholars would study it. It was objectively significant, objectively valuable, objectively important. But it was also the product of a historical catastrophe, a revolution that killed millions, a regime that destroyed culture in the name of progress, a fire sale of treasures that should never have been for sale. Marjorie did not think about it that way. She thought about the beauty. She thought about the craftsmanship. She thought about the Fabergé eggs sitting in her collection, glowing with jewels and enamel, proving that she was someone who deserved to own such things. The marriage to Davies lasted longer than the previous two, but it also soured. By the early 1950s, Davies was ill and irritable. Marjorie could not tolerate irritability. She needed admiration, attention, confirmation that she was special. An aging, sick husband could not provide that. In 1955, they divorced. It was the third marriage over, the third husband left behind. But the Russian collection remained, and it was growing even after Moscow. Marjorie continued to buy Russian art at auctions, from dealers, from other collectors. The obsession that had begun in those Soviet warehouses never ended. She was 68. Most people would have been thinking about slowing down, about settling into old age, about resting on their accomplishments. Marjorie Merriweather Post decided to build another mansion. Chapter 4. The Purchase. After the divorce from Joseph Davies, Marjorie needed a Washington residence. Davies kept their home in the capital. She could have bought any number of houses. Washington in 1955 had plenty of elegant properties for sale. She could have purchased something modest, something manageable, something appropriate for a woman approaching 70. Instead, she found Arbormont. It was a neo-Georgian estate built in the 1920s, situated on the edge of Rock Creek Park. Elegant, but not ostentatious by the standards of her other properties. It had been built for Helen Blodgett Irwin, the wife of a Michigan lumber tycoon, and designed in that symmetrical, classical style that evoked 18th century English country houses. Marjorie saw potential. More than that, she saw purpose. She had been thinking about legacy, about what would happen to her collections after she died. She had the Russian Imperial art. She had her French decorative pieces. She had jewelry, furniture, porcelain, all of it accumulated over decades of obsessive collecting. It was important to be dispersed, she believed. It needed to be kept together, to be preserved as a whole, to be made available to the public. She would create a museum, but not after her death. During her lifetime, she would live in the museum. She would open it to visitors. She would show young Americans, as she said, how someone lived in the 20th century, and how this person could collect works of art the way I have. It was a grand vision. It was also deeply revealing. Marjorie wanted people to see not just the art, but her, the person who collected it. She craved recognition. She needed to matter. Building a museum was one way to ensure that her name would not be forgotten after she was gone. She purchased Arbormont in 1955 and immediately renamed it Hillwood, the same name she had used for her Long Island estate. The name carried weight for her, echoed something about home and permanence, and the places where she felt, if not happy, then at least purposeful. Then she set about destroying it. Not the building itself, not the bones of the structure, but everything inside. She hired architect Alexander McIlvaine and gave him clear instructions. Gut the interior. Tear out the walls, redesign the spaces to showcase her collections. Make this house a setting worthy of Russian imperial art and French decorative masterpieces. The renovation took 2 years. Workers stripped rooms down to studs. They reconfigured floor plans. They moved doors and windows. One of Marjorie's specific requests was that the library doors be repositioned to frame a view of the Washington Monument in the distance, a small detail but one that mattered to her, that connected her private space to the grand symbols of American power. She installed her collections room by room. The Russian art went into spaces designed specifically for it, with lighting and display cases that would show the pieces to their best advantage. The French drawing room was filled with 18th century furniture, tapestries, decorative arts arranged with meticulous attention to period and style. The dining room featured porcelain services that had once belonged to Catherine the Great and other Russian royalty. In the breakfast room, she hung a chandelier that had come from the Catherine Palace, one of the imperial residences outside St. Petersburg. Every morning, Marjorie would eat beneath that chandelier, surrounded by orchids in an indoor garden, looking out over her estate. The gardens received equal attention. She hired landscape architects to redesign 13 acres. A French parterre garden was created to complement her 18th century French collection. Formal and geometric with low plantings divided by gravel paths and water channels. A rose garden was designed by Perry Wheeler, who had also worked on the White House Rose Garden, featuring a curved pergola and beds planted with single varieties of floribunda roses. A Japanese-style garden was added, later refined by landscape architect Shogo Maeda, with stone lanterns and carefully placed water features. The orchid greenhouse was expanded and restocked. Marjorie had always loved orchids. Those exotic flowers that required constant care and attention, that would die if neglected, but bloomed spectacularly when given what they needed. She saw something of herself in them, perhaps. The staff quarters were renovated and expanded. Running Hillwood would require an army of workers, full-time live-in servants, groundskeepers, chefs, housekeepers, security. She would eventually employ more than 40 people, all of them necessary to maintain the illusion that this level of beauty and perfection simply existed naturally, effortlessly. The costs were staggering. The exact figures are not recorded with precision, but based on the scope of work, on the quality of materials, on the labor involved. The renovation likely consumed millions of dollars. And that was before filling the house with her collections, before the ongoing operational costs, before the endless maintenance that a property this size demanded. Marjorie was spending her inheritance, not all of it, not yet, but steadily, constantly, with a focus that suggested she believed wealth existed to be used, to be transformed into beauty and legacy. In May of 1957, she welcomed her first guests to the new Hillwood, a quiet gathering, a preview for close friends. Then, on July 7, 1957, she hosted her first major party, a gala that announced to Washington society that Marjorie Merriweather Post was back, established, ready to reign as one of the capital's most important hostesses. Hillwood quickly gained a reputation, not just as a beautiful house, but as one of Washington's most extraordinary estates. Invitations to Marjorie's dinners became prized. Politicians came, diplomats came, military officers came, business leaders came. Anyone who mattered, or wanted to matter, found their way to Hillwood. But even as she was achieving this social triumph, even as she was creating the museum she had envisioned, Marjorie was alone. She had been alone in the ways that mattered for most of her life. 3 failed marriages, daughters who had their own lives, their own concerns, relationships with their mother that were complicated by wealth and control and expectations. She had friends, certainly. She had admirers. She had staff who treated her with the deference that comes from depending on someone for employment. But she did not have equals. She did not have people who could meet her on her own terms, who did not need something from her, who loved her for something other than what she could provide. So she filled the emptiness with things, with beauty, with parties. With the careful arrangement of porcelain and the precise placement of flowers and the satisfaction of knowing that every room in her house was perfect. And in 1958, at age 71, she tried marriage one more time. His name was Herbert Arthur May. He was a wealthy Pittsburgh businessman, former master of foxhounds at the Rolling Rock Hunt Club in Ligonier, Pennsylvania. It is hard to know what she saw in him, what she hoped this fourth attempt at marriage would provide. Companionship, perhaps, someone to fill the empty spaces. It lasted 6 years. In May of 1964, they divorced. Marjorie reclaimed her maiden name, officially becoming Marjorie Merriweather Post once more, the name she had been born with. The name that carried her father's legacy, the name that would go on her gravestone. 4 husbands, 4 failures. At some point, she must have realized that marriage would never work for her, that she was wealthy beyond the comprehension of most men, strong beyond their comfort. Accustomed to having things exactly as she wanted them, men became obstacles. They got in the way. They wanted things she could not give. But Hillwood would never divorce her. Hillwood would never leave. Hillwood demanded constant attention and constant money, but it gave back beauty and purpose and the promise of permanence. She settled into her final years with the house as her companion, her project, her legacy. She continued to collect. She continued to entertain. She began planning for what would happen after she was gone, and that planning would lead to the greatest rejection of her life. Chapter 5. The Smithsonian Dream. In 1962, Marjorie Merriweather Post made a decision that felt, to her, like the culmination of everything she had worked toward. She would give Hillwood to the Smithsonian Institution. The Smithsonian was America's great repository of history and culture, a complex of museums and research facilities that stretched across Washington. It was where important things belonged. It was where permanence was guaranteed. If the Smithsonian accepted Hillwood, it would ensure that her collections remained intact forever, that her name would endure, that young Americans would continue to see what she had assembled and be inspired. She approached Smithsonian Secretary S. Dillon Ripley with the proposal. Hillwood Estate, all of it, the mansion, fully furnished with her collections. Everything as it was, preserved exactly. And to make it possible, she would provide a $10 million endowment, the income from which would cover operational costs. It seemed extraordinarily generous. It was extraordinarily generous by any normal standard. Ripley was intrigued, but cautious. The Smithsonian had taken on private collections before, but nothing quite like this. Hillwood was not just a collection. It was a house, a lifestyle, a very specific vision of how one extraordinarily wealthy woman had chosen to live. Did it fit the Smithsonian's mission to educate the public, or was it excessively personal, a monument to individual wealth rather than a resource for all Americans? In May of 1961, Ripley and members of the Board of Regents visited Hillwood. Marjorie hosted them, showed them through the mansion room by room, explained her vision. The reaction was mixed. Some regents were impressed by the collections, particularly the Russian Imperial art, which was genuinely significant from a historical and cultural perspective. Others were uncomfortable with the opulence, with the sense that accepting Hillwood would mean maintaining a monument to individual wealth, which seemed at odds with the Smithsonian's role as a public institution. But Marjorie was persistent, and she was offering $10 million. In 1962, the Smithsonian and Marjorie reached a preliminary agreement. She would donate Hillwood, and the Smithsonian would operate it as a separate museum. The terms of the bequest would be formalized, but the basic understanding was in place. Marjorie was delighted. She began referring to Hillwood as a future Smithsonian property. She believed the matter was settled. There were complications, though. Conditions that Marjorie insisted upon. The estate could not be used for dining events except for very limited purposes. The collections had to be displayed exactly as she had arranged them. Nothing could be loaned to other museums. New acquisitions had to fit her specific vision. Fresh flowers had to be changed daily throughout the house, just as they had been during her lifetime. These conditions made some of the regents nervous. They suggested that Marjorie was trying to control the museum from beyond the grave, that she wanted Hillwood to remain a shrine to herself rather than a truly public institution. But Marjorie saw it differently. She had spent decades assembling these collections, arranging these rooms, creating this vision. She did not want it changed or diluted. She wanted it preserved exactly as it was, as a complete work of art that included not just the objects, but their arrangement, their context, their relationship to each other. Secretary Ripley continued to have reservations. But he also recognized that the Smithsonian was being offered something unique, collections that would enrich the institution and attract visitors. He moved forward with the negotiations. In January of 1969, the agreement was officially signed. Marjorie Ripley and the Board of Regents gathered at Hillwood to toast the donation. Champagne was poured, photographs were taken, everyone smiled. Marjorie believed she had secured her legacy. She continued living at Hillwood, as the agreement allowed. She continued entertaining. She opened parts of the estate to visitors by appointment, giving tours, showing off the collections, explaining the histories behind the pieces. She was creating a museum while still occupying it as her home. But she was also getting older. Her health was declining. She spent winters at Mar-a-Lago, springs and falls at Hillwood, summers at Camp Topridge in the Adirondacks. The three estates rotated through the seasons, each demanding staff and maintenance and constant attention. On September 12, 1973, Marjorie Merriweather Post died at Hillwood. She had lived 86 years, a long life, a full life, a life of wealth and power and influence that few people ever experience. She was buried in the Rose Garden at Hillwood, beneath an obelisk surrounded by the flowers she had loved. According to her wishes, the estate passed to the Smithsonian Institution. And then everything fell apart. Chapter 6. The Rejection. The Smithsonian took possession of Hillwood in 1973 and immediately began assessing what they had actually acquired. The collections were magnificent. That was undeniable. The Russian Imperial art was museum quality, genuinely important, the kind of material that scholars would want to study and that visitors would be excited to see. The French decorative arts were similarly impressive. Even Marjorie's orchid collection was significant, one of the finest in the country. But the practical realities were daunting. Hillwood was not designed to be a museum in the modern sense. It was a private residence that happened to contain museum-quality objects. Converting it to full museum operations would require extensive modifications. Fire suppression systems would need to be upgraded. Climate control would need to be improved to protect the collections. Accessibility would need to be addressed. Security would need to be enhanced. Even without those capital improvements, the operational costs were staggering. The $10 million endowment that Marjorie had provided generated approximately $450,000 in annual income at the interest rates of the mid-1970s. That seemed substantial. It was not. Running Hillwood as a museum required maintaining gardens, greenhouses, and woodlands. It required keeping rooms in pristine condition. It required specialized staff who understood how to care for Russian imperial art, French decorative pieces, delicate porcelain, historical furniture. It required groundskeepers, horticulturists, security guards, administrators. It required fresh flowers changed daily, as Marjorie's will had specified. The Smithsonian's accountants ran the numbers. The estimated annual operating cost for Hillwood, maintained to Marjorie's standards, was between $1 and $2 million, possibly more. The endowment income would cover less than a quarter of that. The Smithsonian would have to make up the difference from its own funds, every year, forever. The amount would likely increase over time as maintenance needs grew and inflation eroded purchasing power. And remember, this was the mid-1970s. The United States was experiencing inflation and economic downturn. The Smithsonian itself was facing budget pressures. The idea of taking on a massive new financial burden to maintain what was essentially a monument to one wealthy woman was becoming increasingly untenable. There were other concerns as well. Secretary Ripley, who had been cautiously supportive of the acquisition, was now dealing with a Smithsonian that was expanding in new directions, creating programs and museums that reflected the changing American cultural landscape. The bicentennial was approaching. There was energy around telling broader, more inclusive stories about American history. Hillwood, with its emphasis on European art and its celebration of Gilded Age wealth, felt out of step with that mission. Some regents questioned whether an institution dedicated to serving the public should be in the business of maintaining an estate that had been designed for private luxury. Was this really what the Smithsonian was for? Was this really the best use of limited resources? Marjorie's conditions made things worse. The strict requirements about how the collections had to be displayed, the prohibition on lending objects to other museums, the insistence on daily fresh flowers, all of it suggested that the Smithsonian was not being given a collection to do with as it saw fit. It was being asked to be the caretaker of Marjorie's very specific vision, to maintain her house as a shrine to herself. The regents began to reconsider. By 1975, it was clear that the Smithsonian was looking for a way out. The endowment had performed poorly in the market downturn. The operating costs were even higher than initially estimated. The modifications needed to bring Hillwood up to museum standards would cost millions more. The math simply did not work. On January 22, 1976, the Board of Regents held a meeting. The topic was Hillwood. The discussion was difficult. Some regents still believed the collections were important enough to fight for. Others argued that the financial burden was unsustainable and that the Smithsonian's mission did not include maintaining Gilded Age estates. The vote was taken. The Smithsonian would return Hillwood to the Marjorie Merriweather Post Foundation, the entity that Marjorie had established to oversee her various properties and ensure compliance with her wishes. On July 1, 1976, the transfer was formalized. The Smithsonian gave Hillwood back. Marjorie had been dead for less than 3 years. The dream she had spent the last decade of her life building, the legacy she had believed was secured, had been rejected. The Smithsonian did not want it. The parallels to Mar-a-Lago were impossible to ignore. Marjorie had tried to give that estate to the government as a winter White House. The government had said no. The costs were overwhelming. The property impractical. Now Hillwood, if the museum she had designed specifically to be accepted, to be valued, to be preserved, had also been rejected. Both times the underlying issue was identical. Marjorie's vision of grandeur demanded more financial commitment than anyone else was willing to provide. The houses she built were beautiful, but they were also burdens. They consumed fortunes when she was alive to pay for them. But once she was gone, once her wealth was no longer directly available to keep them running, they became financially unsustainable for anyone else. It is hard not to see tragedy in that. A woman who spent her entire adult life trying to build something permanent, something that would outlast her, discovered that the only thing permanent about great wealth is its ability to vanish when the source of wealth is gone. The Post Foundation took Hillwood back and faced the same question the Smithsonian had faced. How do you maintain this? How do you pay for it? The answer would require selling other pieces of Marjorie's empire. Mar-a-Lago would eventually be sold in 1985 to Donald Trump for $8 million, a fraction of what it had cost to build. The proceeds would go into Hillwood's endowment. Trying to create the financial stability that Marjorie's original bequest had failed to provide. But even that would not be enough. Not really. Not for decades. Hillwood would survive, but only barely. And the cost of that survival would be measured not just in money, but in the slow erosion of Marjorie's vision, the compromises and changes required to make the museum financially viable. The estate that had consumed her fortune would continue demanding resources, even after she was gone, even after she was buried in the garden, requiring more and more to justify its existence. Chapter 7. The Workers. Remember, to understand Hillwood, you have to understand the people who made it function, not Marjorie, not the architects or landscape designers or curators, the people who actually did the work. They rarely appear in the historical record. Their names are mostly lost. But they were there, every day, dozens of them, keeping the mansion alive. The kitchens operated on a schedule that was relentless. When Marjorie was in residence, meals had to be perfect. Breakfast trays prepared the night before, sent up to guest rooms by 9:30 in the morning. Lunch served precisely on time. Dinners for anywhere from 6 to 50 guests, depending on whether it was a family meal or one of Marjorie's parties. The head chef commanded a staff that varied in size but could include 3 or 4 other cooks during busy periods. They worked with ingredients that Marjorie insisted be the finest available, regardless of cost. The menus were often French, sometimes Russian, occasionally American, but elevated, never simple. Sauces had to be perfectly balanced. Presentations had to be elegant. Timing had to be exact. The kitchen staff worked 12-hour shifts when major events were scheduled, sometimes longer. They stood over hot stoves in a basement space that was well-equipped but not spacious, managing multiple dishes at once, plating food with precision, sending it upstairs where it would be served on porcelain that had once belonged to Russian empresses. They tasted the food they prepared. They never ate it in the dining room. The housekeepers maintained rooms filled with objects that could not be replaced if broken. Dusting a room full of Fabergé pieces required a level of care that was exhausting. Every surface had to be cleaned without disturbing the careful arrangements Marjorie had specified. Every piece had to be handled with white gloves. Jia returned to exactly the position it had occupied before. Fresh flowers had to be placed daily. Not just any flowers, but arrangements that matched the aesthetic of each room, that complemented the colors and styles of the collections. When flowers wilted, they had to be removed immediately. Marjorie noticed wilted flowers. She noticed everything. Laundry was constant, linens from guest bedrooms, tablecloths from dinners. Marjorie's personal wardrobe, which was extensive and required specialized care, delicate fabrics, expensive garments. Nothing could be washed carelessly. Nothing could shrink or fade or be returned with a stain still visible. The women who did this work, and they were almost all women, arrived early and left late. Their wages were better than many service jobs, which was one reason they stayed. But better than many service jobs still meant modest pay. Certainly nothing comparable to the wealth surrounding them. Outside, the groundskeepers faced their own challenges. The carefully designed gardens required constant attention. The rose garden needed pruning, fertilizing, pest control, deadheading. The French parterre needed its geometric beds maintained with precision. The Japanese garden needed raking, weeding, careful management of water features. The orchid greenhouses demanded daily monitoring. Orchids are finicky. They need specific temperatures, specific humidity levels, specific amounts of light. They need to be watered carefully, not excessively, and never inadequately. They need to be repotted when they outgrow their containers. They need fertilizer on precise schedules. During Marjorie's lifetime, the head gardener was responsible for ensuring that orchids were always in bloom in the house, that arrangements were always fresh, that the greenhouses were always producing new flowers. It was a full-time job. It required expertise. It required patience. It paid a working-class wage. The social division at Hillwood was absolute. The staff used separate entrances. They moved through service corridors that kept them out of sight when guests were present. They ate in their own dining area. They lived when they lived on the property, in quarters that were comfortable, but clearly separated from the main house. Marjorie knew their names. She asked about their families. She gave Christmas bonuses. By the standards of wealthy employers in the mid-20th century, she was considered generous. But generosity is relative. The woman who spent millions on Russian art and French furniture, who maintained 3 separate estates, who traveled by private plane and yacht, who spent more on a single dinner party than her staff earned in months, was still an employer extracting labor for wages that kept her workers in a different economic class entirely. Some of them stayed for decades. Loyalty in service work is complex. Part of it is genuine affection for an employer who treats you decently. Part of it is the practical reality that finding another job might mean worse conditions, lower pay, less stability. And part of it, for some, was the proximity to beauty. Working at Hillwood meant being surrounded by extraordinary things, even if you could never own them. It meant being part of something larger than an ordinary life, even if you were only part of it as staff. One former housekeeper, interviewed years later, remembered the feeling of walking through the mansion early in the morning before anyone else was awake, the way sunlight came through the windows and hit the French furniture, the way the Russian icons seemed to glow, the way the house felt alive with history. She also remembered her hands cracked from cleaning solutions, aching from hours of polishing silver and dusting porcelain. She remembered being tired all the time. She remembered missing her daughter's school events because the schedule did not allow for time off during the busy season. The beauty was real. The work was real. Both could be true at the same time. When Marjorie died and the Smithsonian took over, many of the staff worried they would lose their jobs. Some did. The institution could not afford to maintain the full complement of workers that Marjorie had employed. Budgets were tighter. Standards were adjusted. When the Smithsonian returned Hillwood to the Post Foundation and the property was converted to a public museum, more changes came. The museum needed different kinds of workers, educators, curators, museum professionals. Some of the old service staff stayed on, adapting to new roles. Others left or retired. The estate continued demanding labor. Just different labor. The nature of service changed, but the fundamental reality remained the same. Hillwood could not exist without people willing to work for wages that were a tiny fraction of the value they helped create and maintain. That truth applies to every great estate, every museum, every monument to wealth. Behind the beauty is work. Behind the work are people, and those people are almost never the ones who get remembered. Marjorie Merriweather Post's name is on the museum. Her collections are what visitors come to see. Her vision is what guides the institution. But the people who made it possible, who make it possible still, remain largely anonymous. Their contribution is acknowledged in the abstract, appreciated in general terms, but rarely examined in the specific, intimate ways that matter. They built the dream. They maintained the dream. And when the dream proved financially untenable for the Smithsonian, they were the ones whose jobs became uncertain, whose futures were thrown into doubt. Hillwood survived. The workers survived as well, most of them, finding new positions or adapting to new roles. But the mansion survived because it was valuable as a building, as a collection, as a cultural asset. The workers survived because they were resilient, because they found other jobs, because they had to. The estate has never had to find another job. It simply demands that others take care of it. And they do because someone always does, because that is how wealth works. It creates dependence. It creates a class of people whose livelihood depends on maintaining the things that wealth has built. And then it calls that generosity. Chapter 8. What it really cost. Calculating what Marjorie Merriweather Post spent across her lifetime is nearly impossible. Records are incomplete. Many purchases were private. Some costs were absorbed by General Foods, others by personal funds. The lines between them blurred in ways that were common for wealthy business owners of that era. But we can try to assemble the pieces. She inherited $20 million in 1914. In today's money, that is approximately $550 million. An enormous fortune, enough to live lavishly for multiple lifetimes. General Foods grew steadily under her and E.F. Hutton's leadership. By the time the company went public in the 1920s, it was worth hundreds of millions. Marjorie's share fluctuated with the market, but at her peak, her personal wealth was estimated at $250 million by 1920s standards. In current dollars, that is several billion. She was, for much of her life, the wealthiest woman in America. Now let us count what she spent. The estates alone consumed staggering sums. Mar-a-Lago, already detailed in an earlier chapter, required millions to construct and furnishings alone, with maintenance costs running hundreds of thousands annually for over 4 decades. Hillwood on Long Island, purchased and extensively renovated in 1922, eventually grew to 176 acres with multiple buildings. Cost difficult to estimate precisely, but at least several million in 1920s dollars, likely equivalent to 70 to 100 million today. Camp Topridge in the Adirondacks. Built in the 1920s, eventually grew to 70 buildings on 300 acres, another multi-million-dollar project, likely equivalent to 50 million or more in current dollars. The Sea Cloud yacht, built in 1931 for Marjorie and E.F. Hutton. At 316 feet, it was the largest privately owned seagoing yacht in the world when launched. Construction cost approximately $1 million in 1931, equivalent to roughly $20 million today. Operating costs for a vessel that size ran to hundreds of thousands annually. Hillwood in Washington purchased 1955, renovated over 2 years. The exact cost is not recorded, but given the scope of the work, gutting and rebuilding the interior, redesigning the gardens, it likely consumed several million, equivalent to 25 to 50 million in current dollars. Now the collections. French decorative arts, accumulated from the 1910s through the 1960s. Exact costs unknown, but likely hundreds of thousands of dollars over the decades, equivalent to tens of millions today. Russian Imperial art, primarily acquired in Moscow 1937 to 1938, then supplemented through purchases at auctions and from dealers for the next 30-plus years. The Moscow purchases alone likely totaled several $100,000, equivalent to many millions today. Subsequent purchases added considerably more. Jewelry, including pieces that had belonged to Marie Antoinette and Empress Marie Louise. Each major piece cost tens of thousands in the mid-20th century, equivalent to hundreds of thousands, or millions today. Porcelain, furniture, textiles, art, all accumulated constantly across 6 decades. Then there are the operational costs. Maintaining 3 major estates simultaneously required staggering amounts of money. The staff payrolls alone across all properties likely ran to hundreds of thousands annually in mid-century dollars, equivalent to millions today. Utilities, repairs, landscaping, supplies, insurance, property taxes, all of it mounting year after year after year. When you add it all together, when you try to calculate the total amount Marjorie Merriweather Post spent across her lifetime, you arrive at a number that is difficult to comprehend. Hundreds of millions in the currency of her time, likely well over $1 billion in current dollars, possibly much more. And remember, this was not wealth accumulated and then spent. This was wealth being constantly replenished by General Foods dividends and then immediately consumed by the estates and collections. A river of money flowing in and flowing out, year after year after year. Most people cannot imagine having that much money. Most people cannot imagine spending that much money. The scale is so far beyond ordinary life that it becomes almost abstract. But there is another cost, harder to quantify but equally real. 4 marriages, all failed. Whether the failures were caused by wealth or merely complicated by it, the pattern suggests that money did not purchase happiness in relationships. It bought temporary partnerships. It bought companionship for a while, but it did not secure lasting love. 3 daughters, all with complicated relationships with their mother. Adelaide, Eleanor, and Dina each struggled with being the children of one of America's wealthiest women. Marjorie controlled through money, whether she meant to or not. She had expectations, she had standards, and her daughters lived in her shadow, aware that they could never quite escape the weight of the Post fortune and the Post name. Marjorie herself, increasingly isolated as she aged. Yes, she had admirers. Yes, she had staff. Yes, she had people who came to her parties and praised her taste and accepted her hospitality. But did she have friends? Real friends? The kind who loved her for herself rather than for what she could provide? The evidence suggests not many. The evidence suggests that wealth created distance. It made genuine connection difficult because every relationship was complicated by the question of money, of what Marjorie could give or withhold, of whether people wanted her or wanted access to her fortune. And finally, there is the question of meaning. Marjorie spent $1 billion more or less creating beauty. The estates were beautiful. The collections were beautiful. The gardens, the orchids, the Fabergé eggs, all beautiful. But what did it prove? That she had good taste? That was true, but it is a limited accomplishment. That she was important? She was certainly visible, certainly powerful, certainly someone who mattered in Washington society. But did any of it answer the question that seems to have driven her from the beginning? The question of whether she deserved the fortune her father left her, whether she was worthy of being remembered. The Smithsonian's Rejection suggests an answer she would not have wanted. The institution looked at everything she had built and said, essentially, we cannot afford to care about this as much as you cared about it. Your vision requires more financial commitment than anyone else is willing to make. That is the cruelest truth of vast wealth. It can create things that are financially unsustainable for anyone else. It can build dreams that only make sense when the fortune is still intact, still flowing. And when the money stops, or when the source of the money is gone, the dreams become burdens. The government rejected Mar-a-Lago. The Smithsonian rejected Hillwood, both for similar reasons. Financially impractical, excessively personal, overwhelming in their demands. Marjorie Merriweather Post consumed an inheritance trying to build permanence. She spent approximately $1 billion trying to create something that would outlast her, something that would justify her existence, something that would prove she mattered. What she actually created was a series of beautiful, expensive problems that other people would have to solve after she was gone. And perhaps that is the most honest legacy wealth can leave. Chapter 9. The Foundation's Burden. When the Smithsonian returned Hillwood to the Marjorie Merriweather Post Foundation in 1976, the foundation faced an impossible situation. They now owned a mansion they could not afford to maintain. The endowment Marjorie had provided was insufficient. The operating costs were crushing. And yet, the foundation had been created specifically to ensure that Marjorie's wishes were honored, that her properties were preserved according to her vision. Abandoning Hillwood was not an option. Letting it decay was not an option. The foundation had to find a way to make the museum work. The first decision was brutal but necessary. They would sell Mar-a-Lago. The Palm Beach estate had been sitting mostly empty since Marjorie's death. The Post Foundation had tried to use it for charitable purposes, hosting events, but the costs were overwhelming. Property taxes alone ran to hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Maintenance consumed vast sums. Staff were needed even when the house was mostly vacant to prevent decay and theft. In 1977, the foundation offered Mar-a-Lago to the federal government, hoping it might become the winter White House that Marjorie had once envisioned. The government declined, just as it had when Marjorie made the same offer in her will. The answer was familiar: financially impractical, operationally complex, ultimately untenable. The house sat on the market for years. It was massive for most buyers, costly to operate, highly specific in its design. Finally, in 1985, Donald Trump purchased it for $8 million, a fraction of what it had cost Marjorie to build, but the best offer the foundation could secure. That $8 million went into Hillwood's endowment. Combined with careful investment management and some additional fundraising, the endowment slowly grew. By the late 1990s, it had reached approximately $50 million. By the 21st century, it would grow to $200 million. But even that proved insufficient. In 1977, the foundation opened Hillwood to the public, not as a full-scale museum, not yet. Access was limited. Visitors needed written appointments. Tours were small, carefully controlled. The house was fragile, the collections valuable, mass tourism impossible. Marjorie's oldest daughter, Adelaide, oversaw the opening. She invited friends and art lovers, people who would appreciate what her mother had created. It was intimate, exclusive, more like visiting a private home than a museum. That model could not sustain itself financially. Over the next 2 decades, under the leadership of Marjorie's granddaughter Ellen Charles and museum director Fred Fisher, Hillwood gradually transformed into a professional museum. Curators were hired to research the collections and publish scholarly articles. Conservation specialists were brought in to care for the fragile objects. Educational programs were developed. Public access was expanded from 4 days a week to 6. The gardens became a major draw. People who had no interest in Russian imperial art would visit Hillwood just to see the roses in bloom or walk through the Japanese garden. The orchid greenhouse became famous among horticulture enthusiasts. The museum learned to market itself not just as Marjorie Merriweather Post's home, but as a cultural destination. Special exhibitions were organized, events were hosted. The Merriweather Cafe opened, offering lunch and afternoon tea, generating revenue while giving visitors a reason to stay longer. It worked, slowly, imperfectly. Hillwood stabilized. But it never became easy. Museums are expensive, even when you are not trying to maintain Gilded Age standards. Even when you have streamlined operations and modernized, the basic costs are brutal. Climate control for rooms full of delicate art, security systems, insurance, conservation work, staff salaries, marketing, fundraising. And Hillwood had the added burden of maintaining an estate. Not just gallery space, gardens, greenhouses, historic buildings, all of it requiring constant attention. A 3-year renovation project in the late 1990s brought the property up to modern museum standards. Fire suppression systems were installed. Climate control was improved. Accessibility was addressed. The work cost millions, funded by grants, donations, and endowment draws. By the early 21st century, Hillwood was attracting approximately 70,000 visitors annually. Not huge by museum standards, but respectable for a specialized institution. Revenue came from admissions, memberships, the cafe, special events, and most importantly, from fundraising. Because the endowment, even at $200 million, even with careful management and investment returns, still did not cover all operating expenses. The museum needed to raise additional funds every year. Galas were held. Grant applications were written. Wealthy donors were cultivated. The irony was thick. Marjorie had been wealthy enough to build Hillwood, but her endowment proved insufficient to sustain it without ongoing fundraising from others. The fortune that seemed infinite while she was alive proved finite after she died. The foundation staff worked constantly to manage expectations. They could not maintain Hillwood exactly as Marjorie had kept it. Fresh flowers daily in every room proved unsustainable on a museum budget. Some rooms had to be closed off except for special tours. Some of Marjorie's strict display requirements had to be relaxed to allow for conservation needs or educational programs. Each compromise felt like a small betrayal of Marjorie's vision. But without the compromises, the museum would fail, and failure would mean selling off the collections piece by piece, closing the estate, letting decay take over. The foundation members, many of them post-family descendants, wrestled with these questions. They wanted to honor Marjorie's legacy. But they also lived in the real world, where $200 million endowments sound enormous until you actually try to maintain an estate with rooms full of priceless art. The fundamental problem was one Marjorie had never solved, perhaps had never even recognized. She had built things that were financially unsustainable for normal institutional budgets. Her personal wealth had masked the true cost. While she was alive, she could simply write checks to cover whatever was needed. But institutions do not work that way. They need sustainable funding models. They need budgets that balance. They need to justify expenditures to boards and donors, and in the case of government institutions, to taxpayers. Hillwood succeeded eventually in becoming sustainable, but only by becoming something different from what Marjorie had created. Less personal, more professional, more accessible. Less a monument to one woman's taste, and more a cultural resource for the public. That transformation was necessary, but it also meant that the vision Marjorie had spent so much money trying to preserve did not survive intact. It evolved, it adapted, it compromised. The estate that had consumed her fortune kept demanding, but it no longer got everything it asked for. The foundation learned to say no, to make hard choices, to accept that perfection was unaffordable, and Hillwood survived. Not exactly as Marjorie intended, but it survived. Her grave sits in the rose garden still, beneath the obelisk, surrounded by flowers that are still carefully tended, though perhaps not changed quite as often as she would have preferred. Visitors walk past it sometimes without noticing. The museum does not advertise it. The focus is on the collections, on the house. On the broader story, Marjorie sought permanence. She achieved something more complicated. Her name is on the museum. Her biography appears in guidebooks, but the memory is mediated through the institution, filtered through the needs of a functioning museum. It is not the permanent, personal, perfect legacy she envisioned, but it represents what wealth actually purchases in the end. Not perfection, not permanence. Just a chance that something might survive in some form, long enough to matter to someone. Chapter 10. The Price of Beauty. Stand in Hillwood's French drawing room today, and you are surrounded by objects that belonged to kings. The furniture is 18th century, commissioned for French aristocrats before the Revolution. The tapestries tell stories from classical mythology. The porcelain displayed in gilded cases was made in the royal manufactory at Fabergé. It is beautiful, objectively, undeniably beautiful. But there is a question the beauty does not answer. Beyond the dollars spent, beyond the time invested, what did it cost in human terms? Marjorie was married 4 times. Each marriage failed. It is easy to blame the men, to say they were unfaithful or weak or unsuited to a wife who was wealthier and stronger than they were. All of that is partially true. But it is also true that Marjorie was difficult to love, not because she was unkind exactly, but because her wealth created distance. It set standards that were impossible to meet. It turned relationships into transactions, whether she meant it to or not. She needed admiration more than affection. She needed confirmation that she mattered, that her taste was impeccable, that her vision was important. A husband who could not provide that constant validation would eventually disappoint. E.F. Hutton probably came closest to being a true partner. He understood business. He helped build General Foods. He shared for a time her enthusiasm for creating beautiful things, but even that marriage crumbled under the weight of infidelity and incompatible needs. By the time she married Herbert May, her 4th husband, Marjorie had reached 71. The marriage lasted 6 years. She was likely seeking companionship, someone to share Hillwood with, someone to ward off loneliness. But you cannot purchase companionship, not the real kind. You can buy the appearance of it. You can pay staff to be present. You can attract people with invitations to parties and access to wealth, but those people are there for the experience, for the proximity to beauty and power. They are not there for you, not really. Marjorie's 3 daughters had complicated relationships with their mother. Adelaide, the oldest, was dutiful but distant. Eleanor, the middle child, struggled with expectations and comparisons. Dinah, the youngest, became a successful actress and philanthropist in her own right, building a life separate from the Post fortune. All 3 daughters had to navigate the peculiar burden of being Marjorie Merriweather Post's children. The wealth was there always, offering opportunities but also creating pressures. Live up to the name, maintain the standards. Do not embarrass the family. Do not squander what your grandfather built. Marjorie loved her daughters in her way, but her way involved control, financial control, social control. Expectations that were unspoken but pervasive. She gave them advantages, certainly, but she also gave them a legacy that was difficult to carry. When she died and left the bulk of her estate to her daughters, she was giving them wealth. But she was also giving them problems, properties that needed managing, foundations that needed oversight, a public image that needed protecting. One has to wonder whether they wanted any of it. And then there is Marjorie herself. What did she get from all of this? She got beauty. She got to live surrounded by Fabergé eggs and French furniture and orchids that bloomed on demand. She got to entertain presidents and diplomats and anyone else who mattered in Washington society. She got to be known, to be recognized, to be someone whose opinion on art and taste carried weight. But did she achieve happiness? Wealth on that scale is not supposed to bring happiness, people say. It brings comfort, security, power, influence. Happiness is for ordinary people with ordinary concerns, except that Marjorie does not seem to have been happy. Not in the deep, settled way that suggests peace. She was driven. She was constantly building, acquiring, proving. That drive suggests anxiety, not contentment. It suggests someone trying to fill a void that kept opening wider, no matter how much she poured into it. Her father's suicide haunted her, though she rarely spoke of it. C.W. Post had built an empire and then destroyed himself. Unable to escape the darkness inside his own mind, Marjorie inherited his empire and spent the rest of her life trying to prove something, that she could succeed where he had failed, that wealth could mean something more than he had made it mean, that beauty and culture could redeem the compromises and cruelties that business required. The collections she assembled were astonishing. The Russian Imperial art, in particular, represents a level of connoisseurship and historical importance that museums envy. She genuinely cared about these objects, not just as status symbols, but as works of art and history. But she also acquired them at a moment when history was being violently erased. The Soviet Union was selling off imperial treasures because it needed money and because it wanted to destroy the memory of what had come before. Marjorie told herself she was preserving these objects, and in a sense, she was. If she had not bought them, they might have been melted down for their raw materials or lost to neglect, or simply vanished into private collections where they would never be seen again. But she was also profiting from tragedy. She was buying artifacts of a destroyed civilization at bargain prices from a regime that had killed millions of people. There is no clean moral position in that transaction. She was neither hero nor villain, just a wealthy woman with an opportunity to acquire things she wanted, taking advantage of historical circumstances that were horrific. That ambiguity runs through everything she built. The beauty is real. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The cultural value is genuine. But it all sits on a foundation of wealth that was created through business practices that exploited workers, that used advertising to manipulate consumers, that turned food into commodities designed more for profit than nutrition. General Foods made C.W. Post rich by selling products that had minimal actual health value, despite being marketed as health foods. It made Marjorie richer by acquiring brands and creating a conglomerate that controlled large segments of the American food supply. The frozen food innovation was genuinely useful, but it was also about extending control over what people ate and how much they paid for it. The fortune that built Hillwood was not innocent. No fortune of that size is innocent. It comes from somewhere. It represents value extracted from labor, from consumers, from systems that concentrate wealth upward while keeping others in place. Marjorie did not create those systems. She inherited a fortune that was already built on them, but she benefited from them. She expanded them, and she spent the wealth they generated creating monuments to herself. That is not unusual among the very wealthy. Building estates, collecting art, creating foundations that carry your name, all of it is standard behavior for people with hundreds of millions of dollars. Andrew Carnegie built libraries. John D. Rockefeller endowed universities. The Vanderbilts built Biltmore. The DuPonts created Winterthur. Marjorie Merriweather Post built Hillwood, and like all those other estates and institutions. Hillwood is a mixed legacy. It preserves important cultural artifacts. It provides educational opportunities. It employs people. It contributes to public life. But it also stands as a monument to extreme wealth inequality, to the fact that one woman could spend $1 billion on beauty, while millions of people struggled to afford basic necessities. That contradiction is uncomfortable. Museums prefer not to emphasize it. They want to celebrate the beauty, the philanthropy, the vision. They want to tell stories about preservation and education and cultural enrichment. But honest history requires acknowledging the full picture, the beauty and the cost, the public benefit and the private excess, the preservation of art and the consumption of fortunes. Marjorie died believing she had secured her legacy. She had given Hillwood to the Smithsonian. It would become a museum. Her name would endure. Young Americans would see what she had collected and be inspired. Instead, the Smithsonian rejected it. Her legacy was not secure. Her vision required more money than anyone else was willing to provide. Hillwood survived only by changing, by adapting, by becoming something less personal and more institutional than she had intended. She spent everything trying to create permanence, and what actually survived was a compromise. That might be the truest measure of what wealth can actually accomplish. Not the permanence we seek, not the significance we crave, just the possibility that something might continue without us, transformed by needs we did not anticipate, serving purposes we did not choose. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any of us can hope for, whether we have billions or nothing at all. To build something that might outlast us, even if it becomes something we would not quite recognize. Chapter 11. Hillwood Today. Walk through Hillwood Estate today, and you will find a museum that is professional, well-maintained, and genuinely impressive. The gardens bloom on schedule. The greenhouses glow with orchids. The mansion's rooms display the collections with careful attention to lighting, labeling, and conservation. Visitors move through guided tours that explain the history of the objects, the context in which they were created, the significance they hold. Approximately 70,000 people visit Hillwood each year. School groups come for educational programs about Russian history or French decorative arts. Researchers use the library to study Imperial porcelain or Fabergé techniques. Garden clubs tour the landscapes to learn about design principles. It is, by most measures, a success. The Marjorie Merriweather Post Foundation manages the estate as a private museum. The endowment, now around $200 million, provides a stable financial base. Admission fees, memberships, cafe sales, special events, and ongoing fundraising provide additional revenue. The budget is carefully managed. The staff is professional and dedicated. But step back, and the picture becomes more complicated. Hillwood is not what Marjorie intended. It is better in some ways, more accessible, more educational, more responsive to contemporary museum standards. But it is also less personal, less a reflection of one woman's specific vision, more a general collection of Russian and French art that happens to be housed in her former home. The strict conditions she imposed have been relaxed. The collections are occasionally loaned to other museums for special exhibitions. Display arrangements have been changed to accommodate conservation needs. New acquisitions have been made that reflect scholarly priorities rather than Marjorie's personal taste. Fresh flowers are still placed throughout the house, but not daily in every room. The standard has been adjusted to what is financially sustainable. These changes were necessary. Without them, the museum would not have survived. But they represent a slow erosion of what made Hillwood uniquely Marjorie's creation. It is becoming a museum like other museums, distinguished by its collections, but no longer quite so personal in character. The staff who work there now are historians, curators, educators, horticulturists. They are professionals doing professional work. They are not personal servants maintaining a private residence. The relationship is fundamentally different. And that difference matters. When Marjorie was alive, Hillwood existed to serve her vision. She decided what to collect, how to display it, who to invite, when to open the greenhouses. Everything revolved around her preferences. Now Hillwood exists to serve the public. Decisions are made by committees and boards. Budgets are approved through institutional processes. The museum's mission statement emphasizes education and access, not personal expression. This is healthier, probably. Institutions should not be monuments to individuals. Museums should serve broader purposes than glorifying their founders. Public access is more important than preserving one person's exact preferences. But something is lost in that transition. The particular character that comes from a single driving vision. The sense that you are stepping into someone's actual life, not just viewing curated displays. Most visitors do not notice this. They see beautiful rooms and beautiful objects and assume this is how Hillwood always was. They do not know about the Smithsonian rejection. They do not think about the compromises required to make the museum sustainable. They certainly do not worry about whether the flowers are changed daily. They come for the Fabergé eggs. They come for the gardens. They come because it is one of Washington's hidden treasures, a place most tourists miss, but that offers something special if you know to look for it. And in that sense, Marjorie's vision succeeded. Hillwood is special. It is worth visiting. The collections are important. The estate is beautiful, but did it prove what she needed it to prove? Did it answer the question that drove her for 60 years? The question of whether she deserved the fortune her father left her? Whether she mattered in ways that would outlast her? The answer is complicated. She mattered in the sense that her name is attached to an institution that continues operating 50 years after her death. She mattered in the sense that her collections are preserved and accessible. She mattered in the sense that she built something that adds value to public life, but she did not matter in the way she wanted. She sought recognition as an individual, as someone whose specific taste and vision were so extraordinary that they needed to be preserved exactly as she created them. She wanted permanence on her terms. Instead, she achieved institutional adaptation. Her possessions survived. Her vision was modified. That might be the most honest legacy wealth can create. Not perfect permanence, but conditional survival. Things last as long as someone else is willing to pay for them to last. And they last in the forms that other people decide are valuable, not necessarily in the forms you intended. Walk past Marjorie's grave in the rose garden, and you might notice that most visitors do not even see it. They are looking at the flowers, at the view, at the greenhouse in the distance. The obelisk marking her burial spot is just another design element in a carefully composed landscape. She is there, but she is not the focus anymore. The focus is the place she created, which has become larger than her, more important than her. Separated from her in ways she would not have chosen. Hillwood survived the Smithsonian rejection. It survived the financial crises. It survived the transformation from private home to public museum. It will probably survive another generation and another after that, as long as the endowment holds and the foundation can continue raising supplemental funds. But what survives is not Marjorie Merriweather Post. Not really. What survives is a museum that bears her name and houses her collections, but operates according to priorities and principles that she did not set and might not recognize. You can spend $1 billion trying to make yourself permanent. You can build mansions and fill them with treasures and write strict wills that try to control the future. You can pour everything you have into creating something that will outlast you. But you cannot control what it becomes after you are gone. You cannot force people to care about it the way you cared about it. You cannot spend enough money to make yourself unforgettable. All you can do is build something beautiful and hope that someone else, for their own reasons, decides it is worth keeping. Hillwood was worth keeping, but not for Marjorie, for the collections, for the gardens, for the opportunities it provides for education and enjoyment. Marjorie herself is secondary now, a fascinating historical figure, a woman of her time, someone worth knowing about if you are interested in American wealth and social history and the Gilded Age, but not essential, not central, not the point anymore. The estate outlived her, becoming something that was no longer hers, that served purposes beyond her vision, that mattered to people who never met her and never will. That is what wealth accomplishes in the end. Not permanence, not significance, just the possibility that something might continue without you in forms you did not choose, for reasons you did not anticipate, and you will not be there to see it, to approve or disapprove, to adjust or correct, to explain what you really meant. You will be buried in the garden, and people will walk past looking at the roses. Marjorie Merriweather Post achieved in the end what she said she wanted. Hillwood is a museum. The collections are preserved. Young Americans can see Russian imperial art and French decorative treasures that would otherwise be scattered or hidden in private collections. But if you listen closely to what she actually wanted beneath the stated intentions, you hear something different. She wanted proof. Proof that she deserved the $20 million that fell into her lap when her father died. Proof that she was more than C.W. Post's daughter. Proof that she mattered, that her taste was extraordinary, that her vision was worth preserving exactly as she created it. The Smithsonian's rejection must have wounded her had she lived to see it finalized. The institution looked at everything she built and said, essentially, we cannot afford to care about this as much as you needed us to care. That is the risk of building monuments to yourself. They only matter if other people decide they matter. And other people have their own priorities, their own budgets, their own ideas about what is worth preserving. Marjorie spent approximately $1 billion across her lifetime, in inflation-adjusted terms. She built 3 major estates. She assembled 2 world-class art collections. She pioneered frozen food and helped create General Foods, a company that fed millions of Americans. She also went through 4 husbands, each marriage ending in divorce. She maintained relationships with her daughters that were complicated by wealth and control. She lived surrounded by beauty, but apparently not by deep, lasting happiness. And when she died, the institution she had chosen to carry her legacy rejected the gift, sending it back because the costs were overwhelming and the vision excessively personal. Hillwood survived, but only by changing. The museum that exists today preserves her collections, but not her exact vision. It serves the public in ways she did not fully intend. It operates according to budgets and priorities she did not set. The estate that consumed her fortune continues demanding resources. It demands constant maintenance, constant fundraising, constant compromise. It has outlived her and will probably outlive everyone who remembers her personally, but it survives as an institution, not as a monument. There is tragedy in that, but there is also honesty. Wealth does not guarantee permanence. It does not secure significance. It does not prove that you mattered, or that you were worthy, or that you deserved the fortune you inherited. Wealth acquires things, buildings, art, opportunities for pleasure and comfort. It buys the ability to create beauty and to live surrounded by it. But it does not secure the intangible things that Marjorie seems to have wanted most. It does not guarantee love that lasts. It does not ensure children who are unburdened by inheritance. It does not deliver a legacy that survives exactly as you intended. All it offers is a chance that something you built will matter to someone else, for their own reasons, long after you are gone. Marjorie Merriweather Post took that chance. She spent everything building Hillwood, creating the collections, designing the gardens, trying to ensure that it would all survive and be remembered. It did survive, parts of it anyway, in forms she did not entirely choose, for reasons that have evolved beyond her control. And she lies in the rose garden beneath an obelisk surrounded by flowers that are still beautiful, still tended, still blooming. Most visitors walk right past. They are looking at the mansion, at the collections, at the future the place has created for itself, independent of the woman who built it. That is the price of beauty this extreme. It becomes bigger than you. It outlasts you. It transforms into something you did not fully intend, and you cannot stop it. You can only build it and hope. Marjorie Merriweather Post built Hillwood. Hillwood survived her, and that is all wealth can really accomplish. Build things that might survive. Everything else is hope, and silence, and roses. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about wealth and legacy and the complicated people behind these beautiful estates, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates history and architecture. And let me know in the comments what other estates you would like to explore. There are always more stories, always more mansions, always more lives consumed by the hunger for permanence. Thank you for being here.